gentlemen, if you'll find your way to a chair. All right, everybody, I have 6:30 p.m. Welcome to our Wednesday service. We're so thankful that you're here. If you are a guest with us tonight, we want to wish you a warm word of welcome. If you're joining us online, we welcome you to Emmanuel Baptist Church in Manning, South Carolina, and we trust and hope that this service will be a blessing to you. Here at Emmanuel, we are seeking to glorify God by connecting, growing, and serving together in the power of the gospel. If you're a guest, and if perhaps you'd like more information about our church, then on your table is a connect card and a pen. If you want to fill that out and give it to me after the service, we will connect with you later this week and give you a small gift to say thank you for coming. Tonight, we're going to participate in worship by reading the Bible, praying, studying together, and we hope to be done between 7:15 and 7:30. But before that begins, we have a few announcements. First of all, ministry leaders, so children's ministry, youth ministry, women's ministry, men's ministry, outreach ministry, everybody who leads something. We have a ministry leader planning team meeting Sunday, this coming Sunday at 4 p.m. We're going to meet from 4 to 5 here in the fellowship hall where we can learn how to serve together. Immediately following that, April 21st at 5 p.m., also here in the fellowship hall, we're going to have a business meeting where we'll hear reports from committees, we'll vote in a new member, and we'll have a swell time. Next, the following Sunday, April 28th at 5 p.m., we're going to have the Manning Alkaloo Community Group meeting here. We're going to be beginning a new study through the Gospels together. That'll be fun. So if you live in the Manning Alkaloo area, or if you don't have a community group and you want to come hang with ours, then show up here at 5 p.m. April 28th, but do not show up empty-handed. Show up with food to share because we like to eat together. We're Baptists after all. If anybody happens to have a set of crutches, we have a person in our church who needs crutches. That person is my daughter. And so if you have crutches for a person 5'8" to 5'10", and you could bring them by the church before Friday, that would be great. Because we've got a... All right, thank you, Robbie. Ladies, we have our Mother's Day brunch coming up on May 9th. There's a sign-up sheet, and so make sure that you go out there and look at the information regarding that Mother's Day brunch. Always a good time. Looking forward to that, so make sure that you sign up there. Now, we have a children's ministry announcement. And we're going to have Kelsey, our coordinator thereof, to come and make an announcement. Yes. You can do it from there if you can yell. Yeah.
I just, until the end of June, I need a couple of dedicated volunteers, actually 3 dedicated volunteers. 2 would be in nursery, so it wouldn't be every week. It would be a rotation you'd add with Miss Pat. So it would be, if I had 2 extra people, that'd be 3 people to rotate. So that's not that bad. And the other one is I need a helper, not a teacher, but a helper in the preschool classroom. This is for adults, little children who are looking at me going, I want to help. You can't be a helper. You need to be, I believe, at least 18. Someone told me I'm wrong. They're all busy. Anyway, adults would be great. Just pray about it and think about it. Pray that someone would step up. So we have somebody for the pre-K class helper. That is all.
Thank you for that, Kel. So we're asking for Wednesday night help, and we're asking y'all because it's Wednesday night, and you're here. All right? And so I thank you to Faith, who pointed out to me that May 9th is a Thursday. So ladies, that's May 4th. So if you're not going to be watching the entirety of the Star Wars series that day on May the 4th, be with you, then make sure you come. Oh, that's not funny. I'm going to do it. Anyway, we will, you ladies will meet together that day. We all want to sing? Would you like to sing loudly? Would you like to sing a song that has been being sung by Christians since the year 600 AD? Then let's do that together. This is one of my favorites. So you better sing loud. Let's sing together. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word, thou ever with me, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son, thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Heart of my own heart, heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Amen. All right. Youth. Jeremy is not here tonight, so y'all are in here. Adults in here. Children, go to where children go. Youth, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you're stuck in here. I'm sorry you're here with us. But we're going to have fun for a few minutes tonight, because we're going to be learning about church history. Last week we started a series on church history, and we talked about kind of the historical movements that led up to the time when Jesus came into the world. And we looked at a verse from Galatians 4 that said, "In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that he might redeem those under the law." And we kind of tried to answer this question: why did Paul say at the right time? And we talked about how the land of Israel had been a place that had, well, there's been a war in Israel every 44 years on average for the last 4,000 years. And the reason for that is that they are in a particular place where different armies used to travel in order to fight each other. A lot of commerce happened on the road that kind of led through the land of Israel, and it was right at kind of a pinch point, so everybody wanted to control that area. And so we talked about how the Assyrians for a while dominated there, and then the Babylonians dominated that area. Then the Persians took over that area. Then the Greeks took over that area, and then the Romans took over that area. And what we concluded last week, as we began our series on church history, kind of leading up to the beginning of the church, Jesus coming, is we noticed that with each of those different empires coming in and kind of messing with Israel or doing something to that part of the world, that in some way it ended up benefiting the early church when they went to share the gospel. And so we said that the Assyrians, as awful as they were, we talked about that on Sunday, they brought a language called Aramaic in and kind of tied that whole part of the world together with Aramaic. As a matter of fact, Jesus spoke Aramaic. The Babylonians did the same, and interestingly enough, the Babylonians deported Jewish people all over the world when they took over that part of the world. And we said that that was really beneficial because in the book of Acts, whenever the Apostle Paul went to share the gospel somewhere, he would always go to a synagogue first. And we said the reason that there was a synagogue there is because the Apostle Paul, because the Babylonians had established a Jewish colony there. And we talked about what the Persians did in eventually sending many of the Jews sort of back to their homeland, so that when it came time for Jesus to be born, there would be no doubt that he was a true Jewish person, a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David, so that he could claim the right in the historical record of being the Messiah. And then we said the Greeks did amazing things. They brought culture to that part of the world. They brought the Greek language to that part of the world. And mainly what the Greeks did is they kind of tied the whole known world together under one language. And then the Romans came in and they built roads everywhere and brought kind of a basic sort of peace called the Pax Romana. That's where Paxville gets its name from, Pax, peaceful village, even though you go there to get stabbed. But nevertheless, I know that's not true, but I just like making that joke. So we said with each of these empires, an amazing thing happened, that God was doing something over the course of this awful history to make things such that when the gospel was ready to be spread, that it could be spread all over the known world, all over roads, from Jesus, a legitimate Messiah, everywhere, and missionaries and Christian missionaries could go and could find people who would know the law of Moses because of what the Babylonians did. And we just said it's amazing that through all the pain that God was able to do something amazing in setting the world up for Jesus to come. So that was our argument, and we just tried to really say that God is in charge of the history of the world, and he's always up to something. And we live in a day and age when so many people are conspiracy theorists, and they believe that everybody's out to get them, and that the good guys are going to lose and the bad guys are going to win, and we're not in control of anything, and we like to be in control by learning, and we don't even think that the United States landed on the moon, and there are people who believe that the earth is flat, and all kinds of crazy. And what I've tried to argue last week and in many weeks is I actually believe in a conspiracy as well, that there actually is somebody behind the scenes working through everything, and it's the Lord, and it's for his good purposes, and so we need not fear or fall prey to foolish thinking. Well, today what we're going to do is we're going to look at, I'm sorry, guys, you probably had history today in class, and you're thinking, history, it's church history, though. It's Jesus history. So we're going to look at church history from the book of Acts until the year AD 70. Now, if you've been going to church here long enough, you should know that something significant happened in the year AD, Anno Domini, 70. What was it? The destruction of the temple and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. The Romans finally had enough of these tempestuous and pestering Israelites, and so they came in at a certain point and leveled the city of Jerusalem. It's one of the most awful things that's ever happened in history. And so as we look at church history, we're going to look at that period, about a 40-year period, thinking through it. Now, how many of you have ever heard of Islam? I know that's a dumb question. How many of you know how many branches of Islam there are? You may think, oh, aren't they all the same? Are they all the same? You ever wondered why Iraq hates Iran? You ever wondered why some countries would step into Israel and other ostensibly Muslim countries attack Israel? You ever wonder why that kind of thing happens? Because from the outside started, can somebody guess what the early church was assumed to be? Another branch of Judaism. It was just assumed that it was another branch of Judaism, that maybe it was a reformed movement in Judaism. And so Christianity, early on, kind of had to try and distinguish itself, and it had to distinguish itself particularly in a Jewish context. And in those first 40 years, moving from being a movement composed almost entirely of Jewish people to being a movement that was beginning to be significantly composed of Gentile people, caused lots and lots of problems. Now, as we begin tonight, I want to read a verse from the book of Acts, chapter 2, all right? And I'm going to read Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. I really thought I had it. I do have it. And listen to what this says. There's one phrase I want you to pick up, worshiping together. Are you ready? And they, that's the early Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the number, day by day, those who were being saved. Did you notice where those early Christians were worshiping together daily? Where did it say? In the temple. And you have to remember this. Now, that's very interesting because I'm going to ask questions tonight. The temple, what went on in the temple? Sacrifices. And what were those sacrifices intended to do? Cleanse the people and to sort of propitiate God against their sin so that they could continue. Like that was a way that their sins could be forgiven and overlooked so that God could continue to dwell in their midst. Now, let me ask you this question. When Jesus died on the cross and was buried and was raised from the dead, what did his death do? Took care of all the sin sacrifices. So as Thalen said, there's no need for the what? Sacrifices, and therefore there was no need for the what? The temple. And yet, day after day, the early Christians went where to worship? Why? Why did they do that? Well, because not only was Judaism a religion in the sense of people trying to get to relate to God, Judaism was also an entire culture, wasn't it? They had their own dress. They had their own, like they couldn't wear polyester, right? They couldn't mix materials. They had to wear like cotton or linen or leather, like no mixing of things. And so they looked different. They only worshiped one God. When the early Christians came, how many gods did they worship? One, but the rest of the world worshiped so many gods that they thought that if you worshiped one God, you were in essence an atheist. And there are statements calling Christians atheists. Isn't that funny? Because they only worshiped how many gods? One. And so the Jews looked really different. They had their own calendar. They had their own everything. And the early Christians were part of that group. And so they sort of continued in the temple. As a matter of fact, I kind of hate to burst your bubble, but for the most part, being Jewish nowadays is still more cultural than it is religious. In 2015, they did a survey, and 65% of Jewish people living in the Holy Land, 65% said they were not religious or convinced atheists. And yet they would call themselves what? Jews, right? Does anybody know the largest contingent of Christians in the Middle East? Anybody know who those people are? It's Palestinians. Interestingly, I'm just putting that out there for you. Not making comments about wars. I'm just saying that's interesting, isn't it? Because the average kind of American Christian probably feels closer akin to an atheistic Jewish person than they do to a Palestinian Christian, and that might be something we need to think about, even though the war is nasty and nobody should attack. You know what I'm saying? It's just interesting. I'm not making a comment about wars. I'm just saying we've got brothers and sisters. So these Jews were meeting in the temple, kind of living as Jews who worshiped Jesus and met together. And as soon as, Acts 2, 22 through, 42 through 47, it sounded nice. Like if somebody had need, other people would sell their stuff and give to that need, and they ate in each other's home all the time, and they were praying and giving themselves over to the apostles' teaching. And so there's great growth in that book of Acts. But not only is there growth of the church, there's also a growth of problem. And what happened is as soon as that church started to grow, it started to grow among different groups. Let me tell you of a group that you heard of last week, for those of you who are here. The Hellenists. Now, somebody here last week, who's not named Shay, because she's answered everything so far. Gold stars to Shay. When I say Hellenists, who am I talking about? They are Greek-thinking Jewish people. Now, I think sometimes when we watch like Jesus films and like Moses, we think that all of Israel is like Rocky, not Rocky Balboa, but like, rocks everywhere, and it's just kind of a desert. It used to not be that way. It used to be very verdant and green in lots of places. It was like a land flowing with milk and honey. And when Alexander the Great took over the Promised Land, he put lots of Greek-speaking people, and there became lots of Greek-speaking and Greek-thinking Jewish people. Did you know 8 miles from where Jesus grew up, he could have walked down to the road and been in what was, in essence, a Greek city and seen Greek plays and watched Greek dramas and participated in Greek worship. Did you know in the land of Israel there were shrines to Greek and Roman gods, and there were priests there? And so it was a mixed place. It wasn't quite as uniform as we often think that it was. And what happened is a lot of these Greek thinking and Greek cultured Jewish people began to join the church. And that created a problem because the early Christians kind of lived their lives like Jewish people. And so listen to this from Acts chapter 6. If you want to flip there, this is verses 1 to 7. It says, "Now in those days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists," now that's Greek thinking, sort of Greek cultured in a sense, Jewish folks, "arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12, that's the apostles, summoned the full number of the disciples and said, 'It's not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to the prayer and the ministry of the word.' And what they said pleased the whole gathering, and they chose, listen to this, Stephen, that's a Greek name, a man full of faith, Philip, Greek name, Prochorus, guess what kind of name that is? Greek name, Nicanor, Timon, isn't there some character from the Lion King named Timon? Or am I thinking of, anyway, Parmenas, Nicolaus, a proselyte of Antioch. And so they picked 7 people who were Hellenists to help make sure that the distribution of food was equal. They set this before the apostles and prayed and laid their hands on them. And it was such a good thing. It says that the word of God continued to increase, and the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. So the church was growing. Things were great, but whenever there's something great, there's a struggle. And these Hellenists, they're Jewish people, but they're Greek cultured. They sort of, when they moved back to the promised land, like immigrants everywhere, they lived in separate communities, and they spoke Greek, and they read the Greek Old Testament. And so it caused issues as the gospel sort of began to become a little less Jewish and a little more non-Jewish. And things continued to get bad in that first 40 years that the church existed, from AD 30 to AD 70. Because the church continued in conflict, the Stephen, that first one that was mentioned there in Acts 6, became a martyr. One of you kids tell me what martyr means. Yeah, you kill for your faith. It's a Greek word that means witness. So he was stoned to death. It says in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made a great lamentation over him. And it happened to be that there was a man who was standing there holding the coats of the people who were stoning Stephen to death. Does anybody know his name? Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the missionary. And it's an amazing thing what happened with him. And really, Saul of Tarsus becoming Paul the missionary is one of the most important things that ever happened in the history of the Christian church. You know what's interesting about Paul is he was born in Tarsus, which is a city in modern-day Turkey. So he was, in essence, one of those Hellenistic Jews, wasn't he? He came from kind of the Greek part of the world, but he came to Jerusalem when he was young, and he studied at the feet of a teacher named Gamaliel, who was like Dumbledore, right, in Judaism. He was just the man. And Paul became very Hebrew in his thinking. He could speak Aramaic and Hebrew. He could speak Greek. He knew Greek things, but he was also a Roman citizen, which meant he could travel anywhere. He could work in elite circles. He could speak to anybody. And the fact that he was Greek trained was very interesting. Can I tell you a crazy story? Thank you. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul tells his testimony 3 times. And the 3rd time he tells his testimony, he's speaking before a man named King Agrippa. King Agrippa would have been trained in Greek history, Greek philosophy, Greek drama. He would have known so many Greek things. And when the Apostle Paul was speaking to him and telling his testimony, Paul said that when Jesus spoke to him, in essence, he said to him, Paul, stop kicking against the goads. Now, a goad was a thing that was a sharp stick, and you made goats move where you wanted to go. And if a goat kicked against a goad, it would make him bloody and hurt. And so when you say don't kick against the goads, Jesus was saying to Paul, you need to follow me and stop fighting me. Paul only said that when he was speaking to King Agrippa. Did you know that the phrase kicking against the goads comes from the Greek playwright Euripides? And so when Paul was speaking to a Greek-trained person, he threw in quotes from Greek plays so that that person could understand. Because in the play that Euripides wrote, there's a god called Dionysus who says to one of his followers, I'm a god, you need to follow me, stop kicking against the goads. And so when Paul said to Agrippa that Jesus said to him, stop kicking against the goads, Paul was saying, in a way that Agrippa would have understood, that Jesus was God. And so because he was Greek and Roman and Jewish, when Jesus saved Paul, he did something amazing. He saved a person who could go anywhere in the world and travel freely and speak to just about anybody and just share the gospel, share the gospel, share the gospel. So Paul gets saved, and Paul begins really spreading the gospel in that first 40 years, from the time Jesus was raised from the dead until AD, Anno Domini 70, the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, the early church, while it grew and was persecuted, it had a lot of struggles. And there are some things that you may not have ever really considered that are interesting. The early church, during the time from AD 30 to AD 70, at various points there were great famines. As a matter of fact, one of them was prophesied by a Christian prophet named Agabus. And whenever I hear his name, I always think about that math thing. And then I shiver. We used those in my days, kids, not these calculators and phones that y'all use. Anyway, Agabus prophesied that there would be a great famine over all the earth. And because the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were suffering so much, you may not know this, but the Apostle Paul had two things that he did whenever he shared the gospel, and he went to establish a church. He would go and share the gospel, he would establish a church, and then the other thing that the Apostle Paul would do is he'd take a collection for the poor people who were suffering famine in Jerusalem. And many people don't know this. Like that was always something he did, because the Jewish folks back in Jerusalem were persecuted, and they were starving, and they were Christians. And so, in Galatians 2, Paul goes to Jerusalem and he meets James, Jesus' brother, and he meets Peter and he meets John. And they accept Paul and they say this: as you go on your travels, please remember the poor. And Paul says, I was eager to do that. And so listen to this. Paul says in Romans 15, he says, at present I'm going to Jerusalem bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make contribution for the poor among the saints of Jerusalem, for they were pleased to do it. So Paul talks about Philippi, the church of Philippians, and the Corinthians. These were Greek-speaking people, had saved up money that Paul was taking back to Jerusalem. Or 2 Corinthians chapter 9, it's not superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints, for I know the readiness of which I boast about you among the people in Macedonia, saying that you've been ready since last year. I'm sending a brothers so that we can get your money, and so that Macedonians can come with me and we can get what you have, and we can take it and arrange in advance to receive the gift that you promised so it can be given. So the Apostle Paul, not only did he share the gospel, but because the early church in Jerusalem was suffering persecution and famine, he was always taking money from these Greek churches to the Jewish churches. Can I tell you a little insider tip that you'll need to know? 9 times out of 10, when a pastor is preaching about tithing, he's preaching from a text where Paul is talking about collecting for the poor in Jerusalem. Because when Paul's talking about giving money, he's actually not talking about giving money to the local church. Please continue to do that, all right? Because I'll be in famine if you don't. But most of the time, Paul, when he talks about money, is talking about that collection to take back to Jerusalem. Just a tidbit. So there was struggle, there was Paul, there was growth, but there was also division. There was also division. Did y'all ever heard about the time that the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul got in a fight? It wasn't MMA. It wasn't a cage match, but they actually got in a, can you imagine that? So you know, like the Roman Catholic Church, kind of a big deal in the history of the world, right? They say that the first pope or leader of the church was Peter. And we like Peter, right? And we also like Paul. And they got in an argument. Do you know why they got in an argument? It was an argument that got so bad that they actually had to call the entire church together. This happened in about the year 51. they got they got all the leaders of all the churches to meet together in Jerusalem. And you know what they were discussing? They were discussing whether or not they should force these Gentiles to be circumcised. Let's not go into detail about what circumcision is. If you don't know, ask your parent, right? But Jewish people, for all of their lives, had been characterized by being the people who took Sunday off and worshiped, who lived a particular way, who were strict monotheists, and all their males were? Thanks. I always wanted to have a room full of people say circumcised. I now have my wish. And what happened is, all of these Gentiles were now coming into the church. And men, what was true of Gentiles? What did Gentiles not do? They did not circumcise. Now, because of Christianity, many Gentiles now do, and we don't have any checks at the door. And I don't even know how they would know whether or not somebody was circumcised or not. We'll just leave that tidbit of history to the side, whatever. But there was an argument as to whether or not these Gentiles coming into the church had to take up Jewish practices and take up Jewish life. And in Acts chapter 15, that church council met, and does anybody know what they decided? Uh-oh. We'll pray for that. We don't like wrecks. So, your wife?
Yeah, she's okay.
All right, good.
I'll see you sometime this week for breakfast.
Yes, sir. We'll pray for you. Hate that. That can ruin your day. In Acts 15, here's what they decided. And this affects you. Well, this literally affects you. What did they decide? That the Gentile people, the non-Jewish people coming into the church, did not have to be circumcised and did not have to take up Jewish living. If they trusted in Jesus, that was enough. But they were asked to do a couple of things. They were asked to abstain eating things that contain blood, and they were asked to abstain from eating things that had been polluted by idols. Because for those Jewish Christians, it was such a cultural thing, and there was such a revulsion at the idea of eating blood, because the Lord said, remember in Leviticus, you don't eat anything's blood. Why? For the life is in the blood, and that's how I make atonement. And so it was like a real deep-seated kind of like icky thing. Like I have this thing, I'll just tell you a little bit of my history. I had some rough grandparents growing up. I loved them, but on one occasion, they were not awesome. And my grandmother used to chew with her mouth open. And to this very day, when I'm talking to somebody and they're chewing with their mouth open, what happens to me from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet? I just get this feeling, and I hate it, and I wish it weren't the case, and I fight it, but I get it. I know I'm wrong. I know it's my own. It's like it's bad, but it's that sort of thing. Like whenever somebody ate something with blood, and if you eat with food in your mouth or talk with food in your mouth, we all eat with food in our mouth, but if you talk with food in your mouth, I'm not judging you. I'm judging me for how I'm responding, right? You're like, Drew, that explains so much. Yes, it does. But that same sort of reaction happened to these Jewish folks when somebody ate something with blood or something that had been dedicated to idols. And here's why that was a problem. Because all the best meat was sacrificed in honor of the gods, and these temples would then sell that meat. So if you wanted to get good meat, you know where you had to go? You had to go down to the pagan temple. That was their Walmart. But that had all been dedicated to an idol. These Jewish folks just couldn't do that. It was a big deal in 1 Corinthians and in Romans, where these Gentiles were like, it's good meat, demons are nothing. We should be able to have good hamburger. And the Jews were like, I know, but I just can't get over that. Like me, people chewing with food in their mouth and talking with food in their mouth. I'm sorry, it's tough. So that became a big deal. But, so the church said, the Jewish church said, if you can just give us those two things, you don't have to be circumcised. So if you're born into a Christian family, the reason you don't have to be circumcised if you're a male is because of what happened in Acts 15. But what you see is that there's a lot of growth, and then there's also a lot of trouble. a lot of problems. And as the church grew, it became more and more non-Jewish, more and more Gentile. But as soon as that council in Acts 15 decided that you did not have to take up a full Jewish life in order to be a Christian, then all of a sudden, all kinds of Gentiles flooded into the church. And you had these people called God-fearers, who are people who had sort of wanted to be Jewish all of these years, like Madonna. Do y'all know about that? Anyway, but then finally, because of Christianity and Jesus' death, they could come into the hope of the Messiah, the hope of the Jewish people, without having to become Jewish, eating all that kosher meat and not wearing like polyester. They could do all of that and still worship the God of the Jews. And so that grew, and it still created lots of problems. Now, we're coming to a close. We said 7:15 to 7:30. There was one final thing that led finally to the separation of Christianity from Judaism, and we said earlier that it happened in the year 70. And in the year 70, the Romans came in, and a lot of things started happening. So, Peter was no longer in Jerusalem. Paul was not in Jerusalem. In the year 62, James was killed at the command of the Jewish high priest. The Jewish high priest said, murder that guy, and they went and they murdered James. And so there was a little bit of a lack of leadership, and tensions between the Jews and the Romans intensified. Let me give you a little more history here. There was a guy named Judas. There's a reason that we don't name any of our children Judas. They just end up being not great. Judas the Gaulonite and Sadok the Pharisee began to teach the Jews that were in Jerusalem and in the country of Israel that anybody who submitted to the Romans, they were paving the way to abject slavery, and they could not be saved. And so the Jewish folks began to become rebellious and have insurrections, and they began to fight. And they began to fight a Roman governor named Florus, who kind of contributed to all this. And then one of these days, back in this time, there was a high priest named Eleazar, and he persuaded the Jewish people that they should stop offering prayers for Rome and for Caesar. That's bad, right? In Caesar's eyes, they considered that a full-scale rejection. And so the Romans said, well, we're done with them. And they called the president of Syria to march in and to kill him. And he went all throughout the land of Israel. At Joppa, he killed about 9,000 people. He went into the district of Narbatene and killed about 2,000 in Galilee, where Jesus was from. He burned the city of Lydda, and he made all kinds of stuff. And they began to sort of get close to the city of Jerusalem. And then the Jewish folks would like repel them. And then finally that guy left. And the Jews thought that they had won, but the Romans were just regathering their forces, coming down. And in the year AD 67, they surrounded Jerusalem. And for 3 years, they created a siege around Jerusalem, which meant for 3 years, there was no way to get food in. And the only thing they really sent out were bodies, because as people began to starve, they began to what? They began to die. As a matter of fact, the Roman historians have stories about when they finally got into Jerusalem, they found people like eating their own babies. They were so starved. And because they were under siege, there was all kinds of death and decay and nastiness. And the Romans came in and they overtook Jerusalem. Does anybody know historically how many Christians died when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem? None. Do you want to know why? Because Jesus had warned them to run. In the Mount Olivet Discourse, in Luke, it's recorded that Jesus says, where the corpses are, there the vultures will gather. And vulture in Greek is a word that talks about raptors in general. So it can describe a vulture, or it can describe an eagle, or it can describe an owl. And Jesus said, when you see the corpses gather and you see the eagles surround, then you need to run and get out. And when the Romans came in, does anybody know what the Romans had on all of their flags and on all of their standards? Eagles. And the Christians saw that, and they bolted and went to a place called Pella. And so in history, not a single Christian died when Jerusalem was destroyed. But it was destroyed. It was a vicious thing. In the end, about 150,000 Israelites died, and many of the rest of them were sold off into slavery. And there was a man named Titus helping his father Vespasian, who finally came in and destroyed Jerusalem. And it was destroyed for a long, long time. Jesus had predicted in the Olivet Discourse that not one stone would be upon another. You know what happened? At one point, they set Jerusalem on fire. Does anybody know what the temple was covered with? It's covered with gold. And so when that fire heated up, guess what that gold did from that temple? It melted and went down in between the foundation stones. And in order to get all that gold out, what did the Romans do? They just knocked every stone off. Everything that Jesus predicted occurred 40 years. Jesus said, remember, he said this. If you read Matthew 24 through 26, Jesus said within a generation these things will occur. And within 40 years, that's exactly what happened. And when Jerusalem was destroyed, that was kind of the point at which Christianity was no longer seen as a reform movement within Judaism. That was the time at which Christianity began to be seen as its own religion and also as its own problem. And so next week, kids, Lord willing, Jeremy will be back for you. But for the rest of us, we're going to begin looking at what happened in church history from the destruction of Jerusalem until Constantine became emperor and legalized Christianity. All right, so are there any questions about anything? All right, we got one question.
So, Paul had Timothy circumcised.
Yes.
Why?
So Shay just said Paul had Timothy circumcised. Why? Well, Timothy would have been a particular case because his mother was Jewish and his father was Greek. And so any Jewish person who met him would have been like, I wonder which parent ruled the house, or I wonder which way Timothy decided to go. I wonder, like I literally don't know. Like, I'm not trying to be crass. Like, did they check? I don't know. And so what Paul did, because he knew Timothy's particular story, Paul didn't want Timothy's lack of circumcision to be a barrier to him being able to minister the gospel. So you remember at one point the Apostle Paul said, I become all things to all people that I might win some. To the Jews, I act like a Jew. So when Paul was in Jerusalem, in order not to be an offense to people, he would live within the constraints of Judaism. When he was out among the Greeks, he would eat pig. Like he would have sausage biscuits. And, he would act a different way. Not because he was being two-faced, but because he didn't. If he acted like a Jew among Gentiles, that would be weird. And if he acted like a Gentile among Jews, that would be weird. And he couldn't share the gospel. And what he wanted to do is share the gospel. And so Paul would become all things to all people, not a chameleon. He knew that the Gentiles did not need to become Jews. But the same thing for Timothy, since Timothy was his traveling companion. He's like, let's just get you circumcised so that won't be a barrier, because people just won't listen to you if you don't conform a little. And that's actually a good lesson, because I think what a lot of people, especially what a lot of young people want to do, is kind of like be your own person. Don't let anybody tell you what to be. Let's see how that works for you. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you go to an interview, do you want them to know what kind of good worker you are? Or do you want them to be tripped up over the fact that you're wearing a SpongeBob t-shirt and flip-flops? Right? Like, put on a tie. Just wear a tie. Get a job. You want them to care about you and your message and not about what you are or are not doing. And so that's the kind of motivation that drove the Apostle Paul to have Timothy circumcised. Yeah. I just don't want it to be a stumbling block to these Jewish folks. It's not that big a deal. Now, if somebody said, Timothy was saved. Paul said, get circumcised so you're not a stumbling block. But if any of those people would have said to Paul, he has to be circumcised or he cannot be saved, I imagine Paul would have said, well, then he'll never be circumcised, right? I mean, if I can give you an example, there's a lot of people who think, and I'm not trying to be purposely controversial. In the Bible, is drinking a sin or is drunkenness a sin? Drunkenness, right? But there are a lot of people, because of history and because of their lives, and because they had a dad who had alcohol problems, and I understand all of it, that they have a real sort of, I don't like drinking, I don't like to be around people who drink, I think it's sinful, and they can. Don't drink, right? But the minute, and if I was around that person, what is something I would never do? Drink. But if they said, you cannot be a Christian and drink, what would Pastor Drew do? I would go buy a beer and drink it in front of them. Because if you make it a cultural thing and not a gospel thing, I'll work with you. If you make it a gospel thing, that's a problem. Does this make sense? Never been drunk, folks. Don't worry. I like to stay skinny, too. That's just like a carb bomb. I try to stay up. Anyway, but you understand my point. All right, any other questions? I feel like I have to say there's no benefit to drinking alcohol, right? Never be drunk. Never break the law. Always be in control of your faculties. I'm not advocating anything except the gospel. All right. Anything else, anybody? All right. All right, well, final point. Jesus could predict the future because he was God. And in telling his church about the corpses and the eagles, he was doing what he said he would do, and that's this. I will build my what? Church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Final thing. In every age, there probably is something that the church needs to separate itself from culture on in order to stand out as an effective witness to the gospel. Does this make sense? And I'm not entirely sure what it is in our age, but Jesus actually doesn't want us to be offensive or be a stumbling block, but by our love, he does want us to stand out. All right, well, let's go to him in prayer. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the fact that you are building your church, and the gates of death, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Lord, we thank you that you give us your word and you give us the wisdom that we need to live it out effectively in our day. I pray for everyone in here that as we study church history, that it won't be a boring subject, but that we'll be looking to see what you've done for your glory and for your church over 2,000 years. And so, Lord, just pray to help us to worship you on the basis of the history that we learn, and just to be better, wiser people who can read the times that we're in because we know that the times that have gone before. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.